Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Tom LoBianco. Tom is the editor and publisher of 24SightNews on Substack. Tom, welcome.
Hey, Reed, how's it going?
It is going fine. Okay, so we only have, I've got 30 minutes of your time, and
All
so we're
right.
going to make it quick. So we're going to go over three things today. The first is a recap of what I and a bunch of other people learned last year, which is why we're not very surprised about what we're seeing now. Second is how Democrats and independents can compete in a modern media environment. And third, we want to give a special shout out to an individual who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and we'll get to her in a minute. But let's talk about last year's, just for everybody's information. So last year, it wasn't just me, it was probably dozens of us participated in an exercise or series of exercises with the Brennan Center about what a second Trump presidency would look like. And Tom, as I've written several times and you and I have discussed, I'm not really surprised, and I don't think anybody who participated in those is particularly surprised by what we're seeing. I think some of us might be surprised that it didn't happen faster, but certainly not really surprised at all about what's going on within the administration, within the White House, and how they're using the security services, which is what we usually call these things in history books, the security services, to really maintain or appear to maintain a level of control that they probably don't actually have.
Yeah, it's really astounding. And I remember when we were talking about this last year, and it was the nightmare scenario. And now that we are in the middle of it, as you note here, I think it's really important for all of us to keep our wits about us, try to dissect and filter out the bluster versus the reality, right? The reality is this Gestapo-style ICE National Police Force wearing masks and breaking into apartment buildings, attacking civilians, shooting priests, tying up naked children in Chicago. All right, that's the reality of it. But I think it's also interesting and important, and this is something when I talk with quote unquote normies, folks that don't do this stuff for a living, but we are all impacted by it now, who want to know, okay, what's up? What did we vote for last year, including the folks that chose not to vote? All right, because they were just disgusted by all of it. Now we're living in the middle of it. What is it? I think it's very important. I bring this up all the time. The courts are ruling on these things, and for the most part, these court rulings are being followed. But that's not to say it's not precarious, because it very much is. And we are seeing a lot of violence from this administration.
Yeah, well, and again, remember that court rulings are only as good as the people who abide by them. And as we've talked about in numerous times, that the American judiciary system, the federal judiciary, doesn't have an enforcement arm. They rely on the U.S. Marshal Service at the Department of Justice for that. But the Department of Justice is run by a moron par excellence. Her name is Pam Bondi. You might have heard of her. And so obviously they are not going to send marshals to the White House or to the Department of Defense or certainly to their own building to pick people up for not abiding by a court order, even if a judge were to order it. So I think that that's one thing that we have to understand is, what we were exercising ourselves or preparing ourselves for last year, Tom, was, we put it in the context of could they do this, but could they do that? But was really what does it look like when the last norms, when the last traditions, when the last guardrails disappear? Because again, remember, the Constitution embodies a lot of things, but practically it is a piece of paper. And we provide to it a level of reverence that we have all agreed upon. But when we stop agreeing on whether or not the things included in its words matter, then they don't matter anymore. And I think that's where we are now. Now, of course, look, this is not like the Trump administration has taken these things to their furthest extent. It's not to say that other presidential administrations haven't stretched the bounds of what executive authority means, but they went in saying, this is what we're going to do. And as I've said repeatedly, Project 2025 is very simple. Don't need to complicate it. Get rid of the parts of government that help and protect people at the expense of the parts of government that control people. That's it. Nothing more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's an authoritarian attempt. I mean, I would argue that we are not an authoritarian state right now, but clearly they are trying to make the United States an authoritarian state. And the people who know this really, I was at a very interesting conference yesterday, the Marketing and Communications Conference in Arlington, Virginia, talking with folks about about independent media, how everybody's navigating this new Washington. And when I talk with folks who are international, they recognize this and they see it. Folks from Turkey, they say, well, unfortunately, this is why we left Turkey, a decade ago, and now we're seeing it here. But I think that there's, I look at the way J.B. Pritzker is handling this, and I look at the way Newsom is starting to fight back now too, and it does give me some hope for that the federalism, right, that there are enough checks and balances, there are enough people, as you noted, that believe in American democracy and are willing to fight for it, that this is not just a complete steamroller. But God knows that Trump and Stephen Miller, this tiny little big talker person, are trying their damnedest right now and doing a lot of fucking damage.
Or as we like to call him here at the home front, stepdad to Elon Musk's kids. So, but let's talk about that, Tom, because, I was listening to another conversation a couple of weeks ago that, we think about the idea of a democracy and a capitalist economy going hand in hand, but they don't have to, right? I think we always believed that because in the face of the Soviet Union, which was a centrally planned communist economy, right? That democracy and capitalism or a market economy needed each other. It's really not the case, as China has proven, which is you can sell plenty of toasters or plenty of cell phones, right, with a totalitarian surveillance state. So those things do not necessarily go hand in hand, and I think that's a key piece of it too. The other part is how many people believe, and this is a real hard nut to crack, Tom. How many people believe that their vote matters? And if they say, no, my vote doesn't matter, frankly, how many of them are wrong? If 90% of congressional districts are gerrymandered beyond any hope of real competition, and assume that a lot of legislative seats are that way, then why is somebody's whose life has not improved or decreased in the ability to buy groceries or pay their rent or whatever, if their life goes on regardless of what goes on up in the with the Game of Thrones, why do they participate? Like, and I ask myself that question not rhetorically, because
Right.
I've seen it out on the road. Is people are like, I vote, I don't vote, my life doesn't change. And so there's some fundamentals to this that are very hard to recapture once they go. And you said something. We're not in an authoritarian state yet, but the problem is that you don't necessarily know when you cross over, right? You don't know when you've crossed that bridge from one state to another, and I use that like gas versus liquid, right? You don't know when that transformation has taken place until it's already happened.
Yeah, that was there was a great piece in the Atlantic a few weeks ago about the change in Venezuela from when Hugo Chavez came in, the 20 years that it took before the people started, regular people, the professional class started realizing that, hey, I can't get shampoo at the store anymore. Like what the hell is going on? So that was a 20-year transformation. You're right, because then they wake up and they're like, oh shit, dude, like, we're in a dictatorship and this is really, really bad, phenomenally bad. And, I think that I look at things like the ennui of, voters, the concerns of voters, this, and what's fascinating about this to me too is that, we've always talked about, I mean, I've been covering Trump for a decade now. And we've always talked about Trump as as an accelerant, right? That these were things that were in place before, and he just does it more extreme. And and that kind of downplays it, I think, because that extreme can become dictatorship. And to that point, if you look at what used to be considered spin, we're going to win this thing, right? Standard rah rah
Sure.
political BS.
My dad did it for 40 years in Washington. Sure.
Right. I mean, it's American as apple pie. What Trump did was changed it, fighting against Ted Cruz in 2016, and said, "Oh, I won. It was rigged. It was
After
rigged."
the
Da
Iowa
da da da.
caucuses. Right. Right.
Mm-hmm. And look what's happening now. You kind of have a sanitized version of this, but you already have the drumbeat of it because I'm starting to see a lot of this spin, right? So there's two channels of this. One is the Trump extremist. I mean, to the extent he can get out a clean sentence these days, the extremism of Trump versus the NRSC, NRCC, kind of the official Republican messaging. And the official Republican messaging is, oh, we're going to have a great year. We're already shaping up to win the midterms right now. And that's the spin that's being put out there right now. And they really go hand in hand.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about back to Kellyanne Conway and fake news, alternative facts, right? None of it matters. We live in a post-truth world, but of course, truth is subjective in and of itself, right? You can say, Reed, you're bald. I can say, I just have an interesting haircut, right? Like it depends. Truth can be very subjective. But I think that it is something where I think you made a really good point, and then I want to move on to how Democrats and independents navigate this, is if you are hyper wealthy, you either have the money and resources to ride this out or leave if you want. If you are well below the line, you have made a living, or excuse me, you have made a life of trying to figure out how to get by day in and day out. So you actually perversely have a set of skills that help you survive, right? And so they're just like, well, this sucks, and what am I supposed to do about it? But it is that middle, right? I don't even think it's necessarily 50% anymore. I think it's a fairly small, narrow band, but spends a lot of money and has a lot of cultural and economic sway. It's when they stop going to Home Depot, or when they go to Home Depot, they can't get the things they want, or they're so expensive that they can't take care of their lawn or whatever it is, right? There's kids only go to school 3.5 days a week because there's not enough money, whatever that is. But again, that takes years. Sometimes, as you noted in Venezuela, decades, and we'll get back to Venezuela in a minute. Okay, so Tom, second topic. Okay, so in a post-truth, in a post-truth world, in a highly developed media environment, which is constantly changing, which no longer relies on truth or even human created imagery, messaging, anything else, right? How do you compete against a Republican message machine that, guys, I've said this before. Yes, like they're crazy now, but this is 40 or 50 years downstream worth of work, right? It didn't start with Donald Trump 10 years ago. It started with Father Coughlin or Rush Limbaugh 40 years ago. So like we should see these as like they are very evolutionary. They take advantage of what comes online. Sometimes, Tom, they pay for what comes online. They develop what comes online.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, well said all around there. I've gotten questions about this routinely, I would say, over like the last week and a half, which had me thinking about it a lot. And I think there's a couple of things. No, number one is realizing, because I feel like a lot of Democrats and folks that are not directly politically engaged, but just kind of show up for elections, don't really appreciate how much money is put into making the Republican message machine, right? Like Charlie Kirk was made. Now he became an incredible power, and he became a top lieutenant to Donald Trump. But that started with a billionaire. All right. And that started with a heavy investment, which I don't see the Democrats making right now, or at least not nearly at the level that Republicans have always done. But there's a couple things that I think are important here. I talked about this a little bit yesterday at the Mid Atlantic Marketing Summit, on the panel I did with Chris Saliza and Shirakshi Rai from the Hill. We were talking a little bit about this, about how a lot of times people are fighting the last war from the last election. So you see a lot of Democratic operatives, and you see a lot of center left folks and people that care about democracy and really want to live in a democracy, trying to play catch up in 2024 and not looking forward, and trying to get into these platforms and get engaged on these platforms where I would note, look, increasingly, tech is Republican right now. Now that could change, but tech is big tech. Billionaires, the oligarchs, as Biden noted in his farewell speech, is Republican. So what do you do with that? How do you handle that? Well, one thing is you play it forward, and we've talked about this before. We talked about this last year after the election, is showing up in person, because what we hear repeatedly, and I hear this constantly, and I see it reflected in my metrics over at 24Sight. People are exhausted by political news. They're also turning off social media. So real people are unplugging from social media, which means that it's having, look at X, Mecha Hitler, as fucked up as it is also not as impactful as it would have been a decade ago when Twitter was legitimate property.
Right.
All right. So what that means is getting out in public, showing up. For Democrats in particular, and this is really hard for a lot of Democrats, Zoran Mondani understands it. Not so much Abigail Spanberger and kind of like the old establishment Democrats, but a lot of these new Democrats really do understand it, is being present, right? It's kind of, they work in tandem. You have to have a social media presence, but you have to be around people. You can't be hiding. There's no coasting in these elections.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, this is the other part, which is, I mean, there's this quote unquote level of authenticity. And this is what I've tried to tell my Democratic friends. You mentioned a Spanberger or a Cheryl, or take any of them. Like, if you are boring, brace boring, right? That's who you are, right? Like, what are you going to do? I'm going to run the state. I'm going to make sure it makes sense. I'm going to get rid of the corruption and the bad deals. I'm going to make sure that, like, your schools don't suck, that, like, your rural hospital doesn't close, that if you live in the suburbs, you feel safe, right? Like, those are the things that, governors, like mayors, right? Those are real operational jobs. They have a direct effect on people's lives. And this is the other part, is if you want to be boring, also understand that, like, Spanberger, let me just use Virginia for a second. Like, Spanberger can make an argument against Trump because so many people in Northern Virginia are somehow connected to the federal government, whether or not they're employees, contractors, whatever, right? Like, if you're in New Jersey and Miki Sherrill is talking about how Chitterelli is Trump in Trenton, a lot less purchase there, right? Because people are like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, yeah, okay, maybe my prices have gone up, but, like, I don't understand why you're talking about him. Like, my electricity is 10% more expensive now than it was. A bag of groceries that maybe feeds the family for a day is $25, is $50. So, like, what are you talking about? And I think that this also goes back to a little bit of, like, messaging issues, which I have said repeatedly, and people are probably sick of me saying, is, like, messaging is downstream of belief. And so if you refuse to decide what you believe in, and the biggest target you have is Donald Trump, then that's what you'll go with, because it's easy, right? You don't have to really think about it. And no one's going to get upset with you for going after Donald Trump. But the problem is that any Republican that might come across the line from you is either likely to say, I don't know, or they're going to vote for the Republican. And independents are like, what are you talking about? Right. And this goes back to, Tom, what we're talking about, which is, like, the median American voter is somewhere in what's left of the middle class. And if it's a statewide election, they want to hear what you're going to do. And if the answer is, I'm going to create a task force on affordability, they're like, okay, so you're full of shit too. Right. Yeah. Like, they know, like, I think this is a big part of the Democrats' problems, is that it's all based on, Chat GPT, polling, data analysis, focus groups, right? Which are fine to give you a sense of, like, where the environment is, but they don't translate into, like, a human communicating to another human about why you should give me your vote. And I think that is, the issues with the Democrats on social media or in the modern media environment are far more fundamental than just, like, they don't use the right platform, that they're not good at editing, right? You mentioned Mamdani. Like, Mamdani works because, like, he's a good candidate, right? He says things, he does not afraid to say them, right? And what happens is, whether or not it's his own party, the Democrats completely overreact, or even the Republicans didn't overreact as much as the establishment Democrats did, right? If you were gonna beat Mamdani, right, early, even when he was in the primary, you would have said not anything about what he said about Israel, or what he said about police, or what he said about buses or bodegas. And I'm not making a value judgment on any of those. You would have gone, this is a 33-year-old guy who's never managed anything more than a 7-person office. And he now wants to be the mayor of an 8 million person city. Like, you could have really made it a simple argument, which probably would have been far more effective, but you overreacted, right? Because you're afraid of his economics, because you thought you could nail him on, being anti-Semitic or whatever. And it backfired on you. Right? Because you didn't have anything to say about what you were going to do. And last piece of my screed on New York is, and then you chose the least likable guy on the planet, in Andrew Cuomo, to be the guy who was going to take him on. Right?
I keep thinking of this clip, and one of the things which had me thinking about this week is this whole Jay Jones things down in Virginia. which has been blowing up. But, it reminds me, so much of this reminds me of after the election last year, Charlemagne the God was, kind of like on, I would say like 100% in for Kamala, like, a little on the fence with some stuff, right? But, at the end of the day, not pro dictatorship. Okay. Like he was not all in, like, some of these like these tech oligarch people. And he made a great point because afterwards he said, Democrats, you told us that this was the end of democracy, but then you did not behave like it is the end of democracy. And I keep thinking about that because that's what I'm seeing right now with this response in Virginia to this whole Jay Jones thing, right? So, all right, let's take things. I mean, as a journalist, as a reporter, it's my job.
Well, just
to
remind the viewers who
prioritize.
don't live in Virginia what happened.
Sure. So here's the backstory on this. 3 years ago, so Jay Jones is the Democratic nominee for Attorney General down in Virginia. He's running against the incumbent, longtime Republican Jason Miyares. He's kind of a Ted Cruz conservative guy. It's the one seat where the Republicans really have a chance of actually winning it. And even then, it's still not guaranteed right now. So about 3 years ago, there were a string of texts that the Democratic candidate Jay Jones sent to Kerry Coyner, Delegate Kerry Coyner's Republican out of Chesterfield, Virginia, said that if he had 2 bullets and you had the Republican Speaker of the House, Todd Gilbert, Pol Pot, and Hitler, he would use both those bullets on the Republican Speaker, Todd Gilbert.
Well, may I just interrupt? Not only an inappropriate joke, but also a complete ripoff of The Office for those of you who are Office fans. If I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Toby, Hitler, and Osama bin Laden, I'd shoot Toby twice.
See, and this is why I think the Democrats are fucking this up. Okay, you're right. That's why they're completely fucking this up. Number one, if it was a real death threat, why didn't we hear about it until 3 years later?
Right.
Right. Like it's clearly it's not a real death threat. Okay. Number one.
Stupid though.
Yeah, completely stupid. All right, yeah, obviously stupid. All right, political malpractice at the highest order. Clearly, and there's some other shit going on with this Jones guy. I don't even know all of it, but no, guys. And I tell every political operative this. All right, the lowest level when you're starting out, vet your fucking candidates first before somebody else does it for you.
Believe me.
Okay.
Believe me, Jesus. I've learned that the hardest of hard ways. Oh my God. Listen, I mean. My God, I just there will be a time when maybe I'll tell all those stories, but geez, Louise, you could not be more right. God,
look, the response from the Democrats was, from Jay Jones is, I'm sorry. Look, I didn't mean it. God, the Charlie Kirk stuff, terribly sorry. Rather than, go back to the Charlemagne the God thing, which is, hey, this is an existential crisis. You just told us it's an existential crisis. Why aren't you behaving as such? So rather than Jay Jones being, hey, we have a fucking Gestapo being dispatched across America. We have some fake ass South African would be kind of sort of pseudo president who laid off all you people. Like he fired all you guys, arguably illegally. Like instead of talking about that, he's like, oh God, I'm sorry. And that is very much indicative of the Democratic failure in this moment.
Yeah, I don't know if it's probably a basketball analogy, Tom, right? But like the Democrats can't do the pivot, right?
Yes.
They don't have a second move. They say the first thing and then they just leave it there. You got to move from 1, sorry, was stupid, 2, but ...
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And to your point, like this is really hard for Democratic candidates. And again, because what I have observed in nearly 6 years of fighting alongside them is everything is done from a position of fear. If I do this, what will other people think? If I do this, what will they say about me? As opposed to like, I don't friggin' care, right? Like victory is that way, not that way. And I think it's and this is what happens when you have a closed system, political system since 1854, basically, in which, the necessity to have a better idea is often and usually seconded to, well, they're so bad, I'll get elected. Right.
Yes.
And that's not that's also not particularly inspiring. All right. We've only have a few minutes left, Tom. So I'm going to read a citation today. Maria Corina Machado was just awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was born in 1967 in Venezuela. Residence at the time of the award we think is Venezuela, although as I read in the Wall Street Journal, she is actually in hiding. quote, prize motivation for her tireless work promoting democratic rights for the people of Venezuela and for her struggle to achieve a just and peaceful transition from dictatorship to democracy. Now, like, she's in hiding because somebody, the Maduro regime wants to kill her. So give us a sense of how you see that.
Oh, it's powerful, just incredibly powerful. Look, I got friends down in Latin America. I got friends from Chile who survived Pinochet, and see these stories about Maduro would send out these police forces around the world to murder political dissidents. Okay, so this is what she is fighting against, and what so many Venezuelans have been fighting against. And I think it's a warning. It's a warning call for us here in the United States, because it was not that long ago that Venezuela had a thriving middle class, a thriving professional class. I mean, hell, look at one of the benchmarks of this second Trump term was them telling all of the Latin Americans, them telling South Americans in Florida to win their votes, like, oh, hey, look, we're not going to like fuck with the good people. All right, we're only going after the gangs, quote unquote. And then I think it was 350,000 Venezuelans who fled the fucking dictatorship to seek refuge here because their country had gone to shit under a dictatorship. That's what happens, right? When it's in a dictatorship, life fucking sucks. All right.
Yeah, and I mean, think about over in Europe, the largest human migration since God knows when out of Syria and the Middle East in the midst of a horrible civil war that has fundamentally changed the economic and political dynamics of Europe.
Yes, yes. And think of the incredible heroism, the courage it takes to be an opposition leader, staying in your country. I mean, this is like Zelensky donning
Right.
the war fatigues, all right, showing up to the White House. Oh, and fuck Brian Glenn. All right.
Yeah,
That
he
guy can't
sucks
put on
anyway.
war fatigues. All right. I don't care how nice he says he is. All right. That's the equivalent of Zelensky sitting there in Kiev. All right. And being like, no, I'm leading. That's exactly what she is doing. So yeah, that's incredibly powerful. We see this by example.
Well, and I think, to bring it home for a second, I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were talking about how Governors Newsom and Pritzker were threatening to leave the National Governors Association because the NGA, which is sort of like a club for governors, right? Or hadn't said anything about what's going on. I'm like, really? That's the threat? To leave an organization no otherwise normal human being other than lobbyists knows exists, right? Like that has its conferences once a year in Washington D.C. and the other time in Pebble Beach or wherever the hell. Like, it's just like, really? And I think this is the other part that, Tom, I will take a little bit of personal umbrage to, is that there are a lot of times when I see people who claim to be pro-democracy deciding whether or not they want to work with you if you didn't come from a similar political provenance. And I always ask this, like, what have you put on the line for this? Tell me. What have you left behind? Personally, politically, professionally, safety-wise? Like, tell me what you've put on the line. And that's my point. And I said this, I think, to another person on another interview, is like, if you believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy, why are you not acting that way? Right? Like, why is every action not driven by that? Why is it that why is it that, everybody, so many people, so many leaders still believe that the fever dream will end, right? Like, we'll wake up and this will all go away. Not going to go away. That's not how these things work. All right, Tom, I know I promised you 30 minutes. Where can everybody find you? Where can everybody find 24Sight?
Hey guys, head on over to 24sight.news. It's number 24SIGHT.news. Check out that sweet little sign I got behind me. 24Sight News on Substack, on YouTube.
We're going to get you a bigger sign.
As you know what? That's right. I'm fundraising for it, guys. I'm fundraising. All right.
Send Tom to Staples. Let Tom go to Staples, guys.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Reed.
Absolutely. As always, gang, you can find me here at the home front on Substack, also on all your favorite podcast apps, on TikTok, Twitter, X, says.us, at Reed Galen, Threads, and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA. Tom LoBianco, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Reed.
Everybody else, have a healthy, safe, and happy weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.